Good evening. Welcome to First Baptist Church West this evening, and welcome to this event with Bakari Sellers in the Museum of the New South, and this exciting book that Bakari has done that he's going to be sharing with us along with Mr. Byron. And thank you also from your work here today. We're glad to be able to host this event, and I'm going to turn it over to them and we can get started.
Hi, everybody. I am Byron White. I am the Associate Provost for Urban Research and Community Engagement at UNC Charlotte. I'm a proud member of the board of the Levine Museum of the New South. I chair the program committee, and it's really my great privilege to have the opportunity to help facilitate a conversation with Bakari Sellers. So welcome to Charlotte.
Oh, thank you. Before we begin, I like to remind people I'm from the big city of Denmark, South Carolina, where we have 3 whole stoplights and a blinking light. And my mom and dad always tell me that the 2 most important words in the English language are the words thank you, and they're not nearly said enough. And so before we begin, I want to say thank you to give him a round of applause, our moderator. I told him I wanted him to be his best Don Lemon, Oprah Winfrey blend, and so we'll see.
I'm not off to a very good start.
Well, you're okay. Don't worry. You'll be surprised. I also want to say thank you to Sheriff who's here. Give a round of applause to our Sheriff of Mecklenburg County. Raise your hand, Sheriff. He's not shy, so I don't know why he's acting shy. And to all of the deputies you see in place, and the city police department who's here as well. This is an interesting moment and an interesting time that we live in, and so I just want to say thank you to all of them for being here to keep us safe and healthy and secure during these interesting times we live in. Also, I have a lot of family here, so I don't want to introduce them all, but I do want to say a special thank you to my wife, who is somewhere out here. I don't know where they put her, but she can stand up a little. Oh, she's over there. Okay. Give her a round of applause for being here as well. She's over here. And then a thank you to all of you all, because in the words of the great American poet Sean Carter, also known as Jay-Z, but you could have been anywhere in the world, but you chose to be here today, particularly with this weather. And so we'll have a good time. I'm only 39 years old. I haven't been in politics yet long enough to lie to you, so I will answer any questions that we have.
Great. Yeah. I want to give a shout out as well. Well, first, thank you, Dr. Woods. I appreciate.
I was saving him for last, but go ahead.
No, I got to get back into the.
Got you.
But also, as I'm happy to do this on behalf of the Levine Museum of the New South, but as an administrator at UNC Charlotte, I do want to just acknowledge Dr. Henry Thomas, faculty emeritus, and Dr. Thomas is really one of the founders of the African American Studies department at UNC Charlotte. So very grateful for your work as an administrator and faculty member there. You know, one thing I did want to do at the beginning, your book, a lot of references to your uncles of the past, but your father, and his work as just a legendary civil rights activist. I just wanted to ask, how's your father doing?
Oh, everybody's good. I mean, I think the blessing of life now, one of the things about being a millennial is that you have to watch your parents get older, all right? That you not only, it's like these things that people don't necessarily teach you about as you matriculate. It's like, you know, marriage is a job. You have to work at it every day. You have to deal with the fact that you're now, the young people, little human beings are like dependent upon you for life. And then you have to watch your parents get older. I mean, these are things that you're not really prepared for. One of the most beautiful women I know in my entire life is Mrs. Cooper. I know Ford's in here somewhere, and we're kind of going through that same thing of watching our parents get older because they mean so much, not only to you, but to the community at large. And so that's a part of, you know, becoming, I'm up there now. I'm 39. I'm about to be 40.
You got a big birthday coming up.
Yeah. My knees are hurting, my back. I got to stretch in the morning. I'm doing squats to loosen my hips up.
Yeah.
I don't know where it is going from here, but
Well,
40 is on the horizon.
But do give our best to Dr. Cleveland Sellers.
I will, for sure.
So we'll get started. I'm going to ask, this is a conversation. We were able to get from a few of you some questions ahead of time, and we'll weave those into the conversation. But let me just start by asking about the book, The Moment.
Sure.
Why now? And what audience or audiences did you imagine writing this for?
So why now is a great question, and I had an opportunity to sit down with one of the most amazing women this world has ever seen, and her name was Cicely Tyson. I had an opportunity on a Monday to sit with Cicely Tyson. It was her last interview. She passed away on that Wednesday. We had no idea that she was ill. I don't think she knew she was ill. I just kind of think she was ready to go. And it was funny because our interview was not supposed to be on camera, but Cicely wanted to greet me. And then the interview was about 10, 15 minutes late because Cicely had to get her hair done. And so then we turn on the camera and she's there, and she is just as beautiful as you can imagine. Her skin was flawless. Her hair was well done. I mean, she smelled so good you could smell it through the screen, right? Even though I wasn't with her. And I asked her that question because she wrote one of the best books I've read in the past decade or so. It was her autobiography. And I said, Mrs. Tyson, you're over 90 years old. What took you so long to write an autobiography, a memoir? And in true Cicely Tyson form, she looked me dead in the eyes and she said, I was waiting until I had something to say. And it was so profound because I just really wanted to read about the mess between her and Miles Davis. But like most of us, I mean, that's the chapter I wanted to get to. But it was so profound. And so when I wrote The Moment, it was a more difficult book than I thought, but when I was finished, I was finished. And that's why the book is only slightly more than 200 pages or so, because when I was done writing, I was done writing. And I felt like this particular moment in American history where we were on the precipice of a third Reconstruction, but I felt like we missed it around 2020 was something that I wanted to lend my voice to. And so I was able to put pen to paper, or even in 2022, 23, voice to voice recorder.
Yeah. You talk about, it's a book full of moments.
Yes.
But there is a chapter called The Moment.
Yes.
And in that chapter, I was surprised the moment you talked about was the CNN interview.
Yes.
With John Berman when, after the killing of George Floyd, when you cried on the air. And it was so personal. And the book at the beginning is just this big charge. And then the moment that you describe is this very personal, tender one, really. Just wonder about that.
Yeah, I mean, there are going to be a lot of people who have this question, and you'll be able to sign and spend just a couple of seconds with me as I sign, and people always want to ask me about writing books and how do I get my book published. I'm sure there are about 10 people out here who have that question. And so what I tell people often is that in order for your book or your writings to be a success, it has to be an unadulterated truth, an unvarnished view into who you are. People don't want to just see your successes. If that was the case, they would just scroll through your Instagram. I just kind of despise Instagram. Instagram is like Sports Center. It's just the highlights over and over and over and over again. You only see people make shots on Sports Center, right? You very rarely see them miss shots. That's what Instagram is. People want to spend a lot of time creating a narrative about themselves or others, which only shows the success. But our country is thirsting for this unadulterated view of who you are. Pastor, you will appreciate this, because when I was in politics, I used to always say that being in the ministry and being an elected official, wherever my sheriff is, he will agree with this, but being in the ministry and being an elected official are the only two professions where people expect more from you than they expect from themselves. And so when I was writing, I decided that I was going to make sure, just as I did in my first book, that I kind of gave this unvarnished opinion or view of who I was and speak my truth as I saw it. And I talked about the first picture in the book was my father and John Foreman and Stokely and Willie Ricks and they were with Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier, and they were in front of Rikers Island. They had just been bonded out of jail for protesting apartheid in South Africa, and that intersection of grassroots, intelligentsia, activism, and culture. And then I talked about the moment with me on TV and how that moment was one that uniquely in this new environment we live in was able to touch so many. Because for me, I woke up that morning, tried not to wake up the twins, went out. This is back during the middle of COVID. This is 2020, the height of COVID, when you basically, guys remember this more so than anybody else, but you knew where all your shirts and jackets were, but you knew where none of your suit pants were. Because you did everything with like boxers on or basketball shorts or jogging pants and just a top. And so that's how we did TV. And I went and sat down, and my hair was all kind of woolly. Don Lemon used to always say I looked like a young Teddy Pendergrass. That's what he called me. And so I went on TV, and it was weird because people who know me know I'm really, really emotional. And so I was on after Felonious Floyd, which is George's brother, and Ben Crump, who's a good friend of mine. And I was on with Dante Stallworth and John Berman, and I was able to hear Felonious. I was able to listen to the segment before, and he broke down talking about his brother. And then John Berman just came on with this really big question about, you know, being black and being a parent in this country at that time. And with my daughter upstairs and my kids in the back, I was able to literally, just unintentionally almost, but just being who I am, show those emotions on TV. And I went and fell asleep. And I remember when I woke up, my phone was down to like 30%. I didn't really know why. I went and slept for like another hour because it was a 6 a.m. slot. And by 7:30 when I woke up, it had gone viral. It was everywhere. Everybody had seen it. It was 100 million views on YouTube. It was on every, and so it was something that was able to encapsulate a certain level of pain. Not everybody was receptive to it, because there are a large swath of the public, particularly black men, who, for some, it's not for some reason, but who literally get offended when they see black men cry, particularly on television. So not everybody was thrilled by it, but the overwhelming majority of individuals were able to understand what I was attempting to say, even if it was a really ugly cry.
Yeah. I did read, yeah, it was a...
No, you agreed with, no, you're not. I'm gonna tell my therapist about you.
You mentioned your first book. I was gonna save this for later, but since you mentioned your first book, My Vanishing Country, that book felt like a memoir, a reflection. This book it has some urgency. Is the same mindset you were in when you wrote that book? Are you less hopeful than back then, than that first book, that earlier book?
That's a really good question. So the first book was a memoir, and it was like, it was cathartic or therapeutic. Somebody who's smarter than me in the room can tell me the difference between the two words later, but for me it was probably both of those things. And it was weird because it came out, my first book came out right around the time all of these things were happening, so it hit at the appropriate time. You asked me, am I more or less hopeful? So my father, sometimes when you talk to individuals and you put them in books, you write things that do not jump out to you, but the reader grabs hold to them. And so my father said something in the book which most people who read it grabbed hold to, which says that he believes that we're in 1954. Now, for me, that was not something that I really grabbed hold to, but it was something that when the reader reads it, it stops them or pauses them in their track. Because my dad was born in 1944. And so that means 1954, as he would articulate it, is a year before Emmett Till. It's 14 years before King, the Orangeburg Massacre, and RFK. It's before all of these things that we saw. It's before the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, et cetera. And for someone who's seen all of that to say that this time period that we're in now puts us there is very sobering. So that's one point. And I'm not answering your question directly because I don't know the answer to it. But the second part is, as I was writing sometimes when you write, or you speak into a recorder or whatever it may be, you come up with these things that are pretty, that jump to you. And as I was writing, I was like, I'm a millennial parent, right? And we are going to be the first generation of parents that leaves this country worse than the one that we inherited. And that also is a very sobering reality. Understanding that this country is not going to be, well, at the time I was writing the book, I'm hopeful it will change, but being as honest as I can, during that time frame, this country will be worse off than what my parents and grandparents, et cetera, were able to leave me. And that is a pretty devastating reality.
Yeah. You know, a feature in the book that's, I think, pretty distinctive are these prescriptions.
Yeah.
In each chapter.
Well, my prescriptions are purely for black folk.
Okay.
Now, don't skip it, white folk, but culturally, we do a unique job of identifying problems. And I overgeneralize in the book a lot, specifically for a reason. I mean, there's different tactics when you're writing. Like in my chapter about the black church, I just talk about the black church as a generality, because the first thing people do when you begin to have any criticism about the church is they will walk you down and look you dead in the face and say, my church does X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, this ain't really about your particular church, although I'm certain your church could do more. It's about the collective and the whole and what it should be. And so, the prescriptions are unique because I come from a particular place where I am tired of us identifying problems. Because I believe if you're going to address me with a problem or an ill, we may not be able to agree on a solution, but you should have one. Because that's the level of thinking that's required if we're going to make this. Otherwise, we're gossiping.
Yeah.
All right? I don't really have a lot of time for that. And so what I didn't want the book to be is a collective scream of ills that we face in our community. Right. Because all you have to do is read your local newspaper every day, right? I wanted it to be instead and no one is going to agree with everything that I put in a prescription, and that is not the purpose for doing it. But the purpose is that we're so tired, we're so exhausted, we're so put upon, we're so oppressed, we're so beat up, that it's necessary for me to at least try to start a conversation by getting you off the sidelines.
Yeah. I wanted there are so many things from your father in this book. I kind of want to hear about each one, but we don't have time. But you mentioned the idea of leaving this generation, the generation following having it worse off. And you make that statement in this amazing letter to your son, Stokely, that chapter. Can you tell us about why a chapter that's a letter to your son? Why was that so important?
So first let me preface it, because when I tell people I wrote a letter to my son, the first mind frame they have is Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I'm not Ta-Nehisi Coates. So don't read it looking for that level of, because he is a Baldwin-esque, right? And so don't do that to me or yourself, okay? I'm not trying to set anybody up for failure. But I wanted to have an opportunity for me to have a conversation with my son in a manner in which, when he reads it, it's somewhat evergreen, but it still gives him a sense of pride. And those individuals who are reading it aloud or to themselves or listening to it via Audible will then be encouraged to go out and share those similar stories to the young black men that they find in their lives. You know, it's a weird thing to think that you can do that, but that was the impetus behind it. And so I wanted Stokely to know who his grandfathers were on both sides, mine and my wife's father. I wanted him to know who his great-grandparents were. I wanted him to be able to see everything that was poured into him. And I think that's necessary right now, because also one of the things that's unique, Pastor, I'm probably going to go to him a lot more today than he really wants me to, is that one of the things that is unique about culture, black men, and the black church is that we have this saying that you got to do what? You got to stand in the gap, right? And so not only is that a letter to Stokely, but hopefully when you read it, you'll be like, okay, these are messages that I can go out and be willing and able to stand in that gap with other young men and women.
Right.
Yeah.
So you say in that chapter.
You know, we haven't said anything that this audience has clapped about other than you messing up the mics at the beginning. So I don't know if they are engaged, we doing good, bad, or what. But they haven't. Okay, there we go.
All right.
And if we're not doing good, I was going to blame it on you.
That's fair. That's fair. And we are at church, so. All right. So, do you? It was a little discouraging to hear. I'm a little older than you. I'm somewhere between you and your dad, and I thought like you all were gonna get the thing done, and you're looking to your children and saying, we're leaving it to them. How confident are you that the next generation?
Oh, I'm very confident. So I write about this in the epilogue because it was something I was trying out in different places and different audiences. You know how comedians, when they go to smaller comedy clubs before they have their big Netflix special. And I go to Applebee's a lot. We have an Applebee's on Garner's Ferry. It's across from the Veterans Hospital in Columbia, and it's my space, right? And pray for me. But the reason I go to Applebee's a lot is because they pour the liquor like it ain't their own. Like they just, you know how you go to these nice restaurants and they put like a little, or they put it in a little spindle thing and drop it? Well, at Applebee's, they just pour the liquor and they don't care. And so that's why I go to Applebee's. And so I was talking to the bartender. Oh, look at that.
There you go.
That's the first clap. This strange crowd.
We learned it.
And so I was asking my bartender what year she was born. And she told me she was born in 2000 and I was like, there's more? Right? And then I began to think about it just critically. You know, a child who was born in 2000 has lived through 9/11, a financial crisis, a housing crisis, election of the first black president, creation of the Tea Party, Parkland, re-election of the first black president, Fort Hood, synagogue shooting. They've lived through Mother Emanuel AME, where my good friend Clem and 8 others were killed on a Wednesday night in Bible study, the election of Donald Trump. They've lived through COVID. They've lived through Charlottesville. They lived through January 6th. They lived through October 7th in Israel. They lived through the attempted assassination of the 45th president of the United States. They've lived through all of those things, and they're still here. And so I think that there's one word that I've been playing with a lot, which I believe to be the most valuable word we have, which is grace. And grace is a unique word. So it's not fully fleshed out in my head yet. I'm still working with it and toying with it. But grace is so phenomenal because I believe we have to give that generation more of it, but we also don't give ourselves enough. Because that generation has gone through all of those things under the auspices of social media, where there is a heightened sense of awareness and trying to be something that you're not. I mean, there are so many people that are in this room that are holding their breath that they're not in the Freaknik documentary on Hulu. Like half of you guys would not be where you are today if you guys had an Instagram. But these children, these young folk are managing to get through all of those generations of trauma in 2 decades and still be on the forefront of change. And so that was an easy question to answer.
Yeah.
The answer is, yeah, I have a lot of faith in them.
So you Freaknik, and anyway, I'm going to stay focused. So you have confidence that this next generation will move us forward. Your book looks a lot at the history of where we've been, and I'm trying to reconcile the two. It's just very forward-looking, but
well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't want anybody to leave thinking that I'm giving up hope on the present, because King said, "Only when it's darkest can you see the stars," and so I acknowledge that we're in the nadir, right? I mean, I'm fully aware of where we are. Like, we're in this hole in the bottom, and it's pretty dark, but only when it's darkest can you see the stars. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to climb, and it doesn't mean that I'm not going to lift as I climb, because the purpose of sharing those historical references is because there are entire generations of individuals who have been able to persevere and overcome. And we have to give them the necessary understanding, reverence, and appreciation for their struggle. I always tell people that the most intellectually dishonest statement that you can make is that we haven't necessarily made progress, because I believe we have made a great deal of progress in this country. But people like to put a period on that. It's not a period, it's a comma, because we've made a great deal of progress, but we still have yet a ways to go. And that's how you have to analyze that. Yeah. And so I'm just asserting that we may not get to where we want to be in my generation, but that doesn't mean that we won't ever get there. It just means that we may not get there on the time frame and the pace that I want to be.
So you do in making that and kind of pushing that journey, you use a lot of historical frameworks, from Freedom Summer to Reverend Barber's multiple reconstructions. And you talk a great deal about the summer of '64 and your father in Mississippi. And one thing I found insightful that I just didn't think about was the calculation of enlisting young white people at that time to participate.
Well, young white people, in particular, a lot of young white Jews.
Yes. So I'm curious, when you look at young movements today and efforts like Black Lives Matter, and some of the thinking around approaches like allyship and intersectionality, do you see, how do you see a sort of multicultural participation in what's going on today?
It's necessary. So one of the impetus for his question is that my father, one of his first movement initiatives was to go to Miami University of Ohio. Miami University of Ohio has a very not well-known place in our civil rights history and lore, because Miami University of Ohio is where civil rights workers went to train before they went down to Freedom Summer. And so while my dad was at Miami University of Ohio, he got a phone call that 3 of his friends had gone missing. Those 3 friends were called Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. And so my dad went to this amazingly big city called Philadelphia, Mississippi. It's not, it's the size of this church. And he led the search mission for Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, which we know they were found behind the home of one of the local sheriff's deputies and ministers in the town. And that was kind of his first indoctrination into the movement. And so one of the themes and lessons that we talk about in the book is that I say a couple of things that are decently big and somewhat, I believe they were profound. My mom actually dislikes me for saying one of them, and I'll start with that one, which is that I don't believe this country ever will change until white male evangelicals want it to change. Now, I have to explain Gwen's perspective, because some of you all may agree with her. Her perspective is, why do you give them that much power? And I just say it's a fact of life, Mom. But I also think that it's very difficult in this world we live in today to believe that you're going to be able to get your car out the ditch by yourself. But that's why I also believe that allyship and all those other words, all those big words you use, intersectionality and all these words that people get paid a lot of money for to define and teach classes, are two-way streets. And so what does that mean? So that means that when there's a question about reproductive rights, or there's a question about a long litany of things that you see me out in the streets being a proponent for, when there is a question about economic mobility for black folk or another black man dying in the streets, I need you to be there with me as well. Like this thing, it requires accountability. It requires us all in this fight together. And a lot of people get selfish in their movement, and a lot of people get selfish in their struggle. And we can't afford to be selfish in our struggle. And that's what I have to remind people of.
Do you see, I guess what I'm asking is, do you see young people today with that kind of mindset?
Young people get it better than we do, by far. But you also have to realize that every movement we've ever had in this country that's had any semblance of success has been led by young people. The gay rights movement, the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, the gun rights movement, they've all been led by young people. And so I think the message for a lot of us is that we have to begin to be quiet, because we talk a lot, and we also have to be willing to get out the way, things we don't do well.
Yeah. You spend a good amount of time talking about your role on the legal team representing the family of Andrew Brown in Elizabeth City in 2021. Why was that experience such an important moment?
Andrew Brown was a unique case because I had never felt anything like that in my life. Anybody in here from Pasquotank County? Did I pronounce it right? That's behind God's back. We were all the way up there in Elizabeth City. It was hot. It was the hottest place I think I'd ever been in my life. It was the number one news story in the entire world. In the entire world for a week. All right? So this isn't something this means that when you come outside, like CNN and Fox and MSNBC are like broadcasting live from outside of the courthouse type of. And Andrew Brown was the furthest thing from perfect, but he wasn't violent. And everybody knew he wasn't violent. Now the boy could count, and he sold more dope than anybody could imagine. But he wasn't violent. And he came home one day, and he was a CI. He was a confidential informant. And he came home one day, and they were serving a warrant on him, and Andrew decided to drive off and drive away. And as he was driving away, they fired shots into the back of his car. One of them, assault rifle, hit him in the back of the head. The irony in this whole story is that when they fired these shots, one of the shots actually went into a house across the street, like went and hit the TV in the kitchen across from the table. And it was like 8 o'clock in the morning, and so it was a school bus area right there. And it was just a bad case. And you know, we had a funeral in Elizabeth City, and William Barber spoke, and Al Sharpton spoke, and I spoke, and Ben Crump spoke. And the case was just, it encapsulated so much for me about just how fragile we are as a community, and how it just takes that small incident to make a community explode or come together. The unique part about that case, though, is that community, although I say it's behind God's back, did something I never see a community do before. For 366 days, people protested in a row. Now, some days it was 4, 5, 6 people. Some days it was 400, 500, 600 people. But every day, and when we settled the case, one of the things they asked us to do was, can you please tell those people to go home? I said, we can't. But, you know, it was just Andrew Brown is now in the fraternity of individuals that you don't want to be a part of. You never want that knock on the door that your child is the next Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, your child is the next LaToya James or Keith Lamont or Walter, or your child is, you know, the list goes on and on and on and on of names that we probably we can't recall. I was on a radio show one day. I was in St. Louis, and I was talking about Michael Brown, and I was talking about Michael Brown so much that I had given the date of Alton Sterling. And, you know, and the facts, I was confusing some of the facts with Philando Castile. And I was like, I was on PBS, and she looked at me, and I looked at her, and I was like, that just kind of tells you how bad it is.
Yeah.
And so it's just something that we continuously have to persevere through.
You earlier mentioned the Black church, so I want to come back to some of the specific things you say in the book there. You talk about challenging the black church in a loving way.
Yeah, for sure.
And this is not about this church. It's about the church overall. But you do talk about this longing for this combination of spiritual uplifting and community activism that you remember as a child. And I just wonder if you really see the church getting back to that.
Not now. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I say is that there has been this really commodification, and capitalism has done a number to the black church unlike any other institution. I mean, I knew, respectfully, I don't know what y'all do in offering, but I knew this church, I knew the church was going in a way that was weird when you could start paying your offerings via credit card. Because I was like, I don't really read the Bible like that, but I don't know what scripture that is where you can put your offering and tithes on credit. I just don't know what that is. And one of the things that I wanted, one of the reasons I wrote it is because the church is necessary. It's so necessary. Now, we are in the South now, and where is the most segregated place in a country? The church in the South, all right? But the church is a place that not only gives us the sustenance to be able to survive and the faith to be able to keep going, but there was a period in time when you had churches that were like this church, that were not just Sunday morning ministries, but they were actually doing the work Monday through Saturday as well. You know the stories of when your parents used to drag you to the services all the time. And on Wednesday night, you'd be there at Bible study. On Thursday, it was choir practice. On Friday, it was whatever. But if somebody needed something, the church rallied behind that person that needed something and took care of them. If there was a young boy who wasn't getting his lesson, they made sure that one of the educators in the church spent time with the young boy. If a house burned, I mean, it was just, the church was our epicenter for change. It was necessary. And so the church is probably the only institution in this country, not socially, but culturally, I want to go backwards. And I'm very mindful of saying not socially, but culturally. I want it to go back to a place where it was an institution that we could literally eat off of. And I'm using that metaphorically. That a community that was starving could go to this place that was a home and be that much more, even if it wasn't a Sunday morning. And that is just my fear, because it's not just, whereas you may have one of these in this particular area or 3 of these in this particular area, I would dare say we probably need 13 or 14. And so that was my clarion call in that.
Another part of this book that I really found enlightening is you're really calling out the sophistication of racism today and its many forms. You talk about it being more sophisticated and extreme, and whether it's legalized genocide or you talk about racist capitalists, it's these different modes of it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, and I'll peel back a layer. So I think a lot of times, and I was attempting to have this conversation. I literally had one of the best conversations on race I've ever had in my life this past Friday night on Bill Maher. I don't know if anybody saw that episode. It was fascinating because Bill is Bill, and Ben Shapiro's Ben Shapiro. I mean, we're people who I will hang out with Bill Maher, but I'm not really hanging out with Ben Shapiro. Like, we don't have a lot in common. We come from different perspectives. We have different views about life. And I was attempting to have this conversation on this issue of race, and it was one of the most refreshing conversations because I'm not sure we moved the needle that much with one another, but it was like a respectful conversation, whereas no one was talking over the other person, and they were able to articulate my views, and I was able to articulate my views, and then we went to the back and had some tequila together. Like, that's how these conversations should go. But one of the things that I said, which is where I start with this preface, two prefaces. One, we don't talk to each other enough. Like, y'all don't have any home training, and it bothers me. Like, when you walk into a building, like, speak to the people who clean the building up. Right? Like, all of these law enforcement in here, just simply say thank you, right? So that's first. We don't have dinner together. Remember, you used to have dinner as families? Every Friday night when I was growing up, we would have spaghetti and fried fish. Those things go together. I don't know where y'all from. Thank you. One hand clap. One person with a good culinary taste back there. And so, like, we have to begin to do those simple things again in order to have these conversations. So that's first. The second thing is, we are too quick to cancel people because their ideas are even ignorant or offensive or don't align with our own. And I'm not a big proponent of canceling stupidity. I wouldn't have anybody to talk to. So I would just kind of refrain from being someone who wants to be a part of this culture that we call cancel culture today, because the first thing you want to do when somebody says something crazy is call the person, call their job, and get them. I mean, it's like slow down a little bit. So those are the frameworks for the conversation. And so as you dig into this conversation on race and racism, then I have to make a very bold statement in a word that may not have ever been said in the walls of these churches, so forgive me, but I'm not concerned if anybody ever calls me nigger. I'm not. I get called that enough. The reason all this law enforcement is here tonight is because we've had a lot of issues over the past 3 or 4 days with just an influx of just bad things and bad wishes upon me and everybody else and my family and things like that. And so I'm not really concerned about that. What does make me more concerned, however, is when you grow up in a community like I did in Denmark, where you grew up in a food desert, which means you can't go a mile or two and have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, where if you live in Denmark, South Carolina, your closest, and you're a woman, your closest OBGYN is about 30 minutes away. Or when I was growing up, we didn't have a hospital because our hospital shut down. And our hospital shut down, and when you think about a hospital, and I am talking to you guys like you all are all policymakers because I'm treating you like the intellects that you are in this room. But you have to think about the fact that when you're in a rural community and your hospital shuts down, it's not just the primary case or place that a lot of poor folk go to get health care, but it's also your number 1 or number 2 employer. Also, around a hospital, what else do you have? You got a bakery, you got a pharmacy, you got a florist, you got a little motel, and all of those things dry up as well, right? And so in Denmark as well, we didn't have, our infrastructure was so poor, like a lot of poor areas in North Carolina, that the pipes became rusted and the water became brown, and so the city decided to use a cheap alternative, which was this material that was used for wells and jacuzzis, etc., and it made the water more poisonous, and so the water was less potable than Flint, Michigan. And what if I told you there were 100 cities in the United States that had water that's less potable than Flint, Michigan, right? And so that's all in this one little community, and on top of that, it's along what's called the corridor of shame, where kids go to school and their heating and air don't work, where their infrastructure's falling apart, where the kids go to school in little trailers, right? And when it rains, they have to walk from the main building through the mud to get to their campus, to get to their classroom. And you expect these young people to be able to compete in the 21st century global economy. So those are the type of structures, when I'm talking about institutionalized or structural racism, that we have to begin to disassemble. Now, also, let me just explain something to you about the United States of America briefly, extremely briefly. Please be very intentional with your language as you're beginning to have conversations, particularly in this political season, but especially around the issue of race. Because systems in this country are not broken. Stop saying that. The criminal justice system is not broken. The healthcare system is not broken. In fact, they work is they were intended to work. That drives me mad. Engineers create systems to produce outcomes. So do not be surprised when the output is what it was intended to be. And so what we have to do is deconstruct those systems and imagine her or them in an image that includes all of us. And that's what I try to do.
Yeah. I am going to ask the political question because everybody's waiting. So we're going to ask you that. I do want to, and we're closing, but I do want to ask a question, a central question about black men because it's such an undercurrent of the book, and come back to that. And you say simultaneously that black men, you celebrate the strength and resilience of black men, and then you note the vulnerability of black men at this time. And I wonder if you can help reconcile those two ideas.
Is that the political question you want to ask?
That is not.
Oh, okay.
It's the pre-political question. I want to make sure you address this, though.
You know, in my first book, I had an ode or a couple of chapters to black women. In this book, I wanted to talk directly to black men in particular. And one of the things that I said is that black men for far too long in this country have been just disregarded. And we've just been locked out of the conversation, left out of the conversation. Even more importantly, all right, I got all these women in here and one of y'all clap. Well, we know the one that got a man. No, I'm just joking. And so what I wanted to do is be able to say that black men are thirsting to be involved in this process. And we're having those conversations amongst ourselves, but no one has been listening. And then when you do talk to black men, the only thing this is particularly to my white progressives, the only thing they talk to us about is criminal justice reform, like how to stay out of jail or keep your friends from going to jail. But very rarely are we engaged on the fact that we want to have healthy outcomes for ourselves when we're going through prostate exams or cardiovascular exams. Very rarely do we have a conversation about a public education system which we feel may be failing our children, or small business capital because we are starting small businesses at a rate that's only second to black women. I mean, very rarely are we talked to holistically. And what that means is that when you have these troll farms that we saw a great deal of in 2016, or you have individuals who may display this outward machismo or masculinity, you are at risk of having a few black men around the edges become susceptible to at least listening to them because they feel like they haven't been listened to before. And so that's just where we are, and the warning lights are on. And I was explaining to Democrats in particular that black women are the largest voting base for the Democratic Party, but the second largest voting base have been black men throughout history. And if you continue to ignore that group, you do that at your own peril.
We're seeing that. Okay, the political question. The Republican National Convention is going on as we speak. You mentioned the assassination attempt. The conversations are going on around whether President Biden should drop out of the race. So with your CNN political analyst hat, give us your assessment of the current moment of the presidential race.
Well, this time is unique. I was supposed to be going there in about an hour and 10 minutes, but because of things that are going on, because of this heightened environment, they just told me that they weren't able to ensure my safety and others' safety while being there. And so that just kind of tells you about the environment that we're in.
Wow.
So that's first. Second thing I would say is that I've said a lot of personal prayers for the 45th president of the United States. I've prayed a lot for Donald Trump over these past few days when I saw the incident, because I did so for two reasons. One, because I like to believe I'm decently prayerful. And I think you should pray for your elected officials no matter whether or not you'd ever vote for them or not. You should pray for their health, you should pray for their wisdom, you should pray for their leadership and their guidance. And so, Reverend, you're going to have to help me with the second part because I did so rather selfishly, and I'm not sure if you should pray from a selfish spirit, but I did. because I was afraid that if that bullet was 1 inch in a different direction, that I know for a fact I would not be at this event tonight, because I barely wanted to show up tonight, but I wouldn't be here tonight. And I'm not sure what Sheriff McFadden is. He's somewhere in here. He would have to tell us what that would look like if that bullet had been 1 inch in a different direction. It would just be a different type of atmosphere in this country, one that I don't want to see. And so I prayed from a selfish spirit for the second one. So that's kind of the first thing. From a pure political perspective, nothing about this race has changed. And history is amazing, because history kind of dictates outcomes. And the fundamentals of this presidential race have not changed. And people are like, well, you know, he's going to get sympathy votes. And I'm like, that literally is no such thing. RFK was assassinated in '68, and Democrats got crushed. They tried to shoot Gerald Ford not once, but twice. And then the country was like, but he still ain't smart, I'm not voting for him. Roosevelt, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And the three cases that I just named, none of them. So there's no real such thing as sympathy votes. It comes down to the fundamentals of a race. And it comes down to, and I don't think, I mean, look, I do believe getting shot in the face changes a man. But I do not anticipate or buy into the narrative that the 45th president of the United States will change much. But I say all that to say you got an old guy versus somebody who I believe audiences are particularly clear enough to understand that I still do not want to take this country back to a place where Donald Trump wants it to be. And so now people would ask me to put on my political analyst hat, and I'll do that just briefly before we close. And I would say that nothing much has changed. Donald Trump is winning this race today, but races aren't won and lost in June and July. States that matter are Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina. No, and not Georgia. Georgia's gone, and not Ohio. Ohio been gone, whoever said that. And I believe Georgia's gone. I think Georgia's going to be close, but Georgia's more like a 2 to 3 point state. I think all you have to do is look at how close Stacey Abrams was this time to Brian Kemp, and it was, instead of it being a 30, 40,000 vote race, it was a 300, 400,000 vote race. But North Carolina will replace Georgia in terms of that swing state. The Vice President of the United States is actually coming here this week, if I'm not mistaken. And part of the reason is because you have pastor's friend running for governor, Mark Robinson, against Josh Stein. And so that race will be very interesting. And so you'll have all of these, you'll have those 6 states that are going to determine the outcome. And North Carolina right now is about 4 points. All the other states are within the margin of error. And there's a long way to go. Now, all of these polls that you see had this really weird thing. I just looked at some polls on Sunday morning that came out. They were going to be released and talked about until the attempted assassination attempt, when things kind of shut down in terms of political dialogue. And all those polls had this unique thing. And those polls that came out, they all had, as close as this race was, they had Donald Trump getting 20% of the black vote and 45% of the Hispanic vote. And I told Kevin McCarthy on Friday night when I was talking to him on Real Time, I said, in the overtime segment, the piece that's only on YouTube, I said, well, you know, if Donald Trump gets 20% of the black vote, I'm gonna just sell you this bridge in Brooklyn, all right? Because that ain't necessarily gonna happen, and he's not getting 45% of the Hispanic vote. So it shows you that it's gonna be really close. But I think this race is going to come down to one very particular demographic. And this one demographic hurt my heart in 2016. And the question is, what will they do in 2024? And it's college-educated white women. And so it's a weird thing, because as college-educated white women in particular, I can literally draw a circle outside of Philadelphia. I can draw a circle outside of Detroit. I can draw a circle outside of Phoenix. I can draw a circle outside of, all of these little exurbs and suburbs where this race will be won and lost. And on November 5th, you won't know who won. It may take a few days, but it's going to be a very close election. So,
So Bakari, I'm going back to my old journalism days. I cannot help but ask you this question.
Sure.
Should Joe Biden drop out of the race?
Well, so the first thing I say is that this is Joe Biden's decision and Joe Biden's alone. I do not like the fight in public, because it doesn't help anyone by having this fight in public. Switching horses this late has never proven to be successful. He's old, but there are three alternatives in this race, and people analyze this race the wrong way all the time. There are three alternatives in this race. It's Joe Biden, it's Donald Trump, and it's the couch. And the couch is always very successful. And like I said the other night, the couch literally runs no ads, but people choose the couch year in and year out. And so those three candidates are going to be the choice that you have. I'm going to let the president make his decision. Never in the history of history, though, has a white man ceded all the power in the world to anybody, let alone a black woman, so I'll let you determine that. But, if he decides or wakes up one morning, or God forbid falls down anywhere, if any of those things happen, the only person who can be the nominee is Kamala Harris.
Bakari Sellers, thank you for this gift. We greatly appreciate it. We appreciate your leadership, your forthright direction and guidance to the country, and thank you for being here with us tonight.
Thank you so much.